Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's program. My name is Ricky Bevington. I serve as president of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. The council is a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership organization established in 2010 by Atlanta's foremost corporate and civic leaders. Our mission is to empower Atlantans to lead with global understanding and trusted international relationships so that our city can navigate change, seize opportunity, and shape its future. Throughout the year, we host dozens of high caliber events convening diplomats, dignitaries, executives, students, engaged citizens, all to explore the most pressing global issues of our time. We are very delighted to have you with us today. The statements made today are those of the speaker and not of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. And as was mentioned, this program is on the record. And now, for just a little context before we meet our speaker, today's conversation begins with a powerful reality that is shaping the future of Africa and increasingly the world. Africa is now home to about a fifth of the world's population, more than 1.5 billion people, and is also the youngest continent on Earth. The median age across Africa is just 19 years. Nearly 7 in 10 people in sub-Saharan Africa are under the age of 30. And every year, millions of young Africans are coming of age, politically, economically, socially, and this is creating unprecedented pressure as well as opportunity for political systems to respond. And of course, at the same time, Africa is urbanizing at extraordinary speed. Nearly 45% of Africans now live in cities, a share projected to rise sharply in the coming decades. So cities have become hubs not only of economic aspiration, but of political mobilization, digital activism, and of course, demands for accountability. People want jobs, they want quality, they want the quality of their lives to increase. And of course, against this backdrop, today's program examines how Africa's urban youth are redefining political participation, leadership, and also expectations of democracy all across the continent, and why these shifts matter far beyond Africa's borders. We are very honored and pleased to welcome our expert speaker, Michelle D. Gavin, who's the Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She brings more than 25 years of experience across government policy and nonprofit leadership. Gavin previously served as U.S. Ambassador to Botswana and as U.S. Representative to the Southern African Development Community, and earlier as Senior Director for Africa at the National Security Council, where she helped launch the Young African Leaders Initiative and also led major policy reviews. Gavin has also held senior roles in the U.S. Senate and at the Africa Center, and has long been affiliated as a CFR Fellow. A Rhodes and Truman Scholar, she holds an MPhil from Oxford University and a BA from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service, and she serves on the board of Points of Light. Welcome, Ambassador Gavin.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I will invite Ambassador Gavin to give an opening presentation before we turn to moderated questions from me, followed immediately by an audience Q&A. And again, as was mentioned, you can submit your question by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please make it brief and concise so that I understand what you're trying to convey and ask the moderator. And again, the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask a question. Ambassador, you may begin with your opening remarks.
Great, thanks so much. So that was a great sort of tee up to some of the issues that I want us to talk about today. And I start sort of from this really interesting, at least to me, paradox of a region of the world whose politics in some ways seem characterized by stasis. When you think about aging leaders who've been in power for decades, uh, you know, the leadership in Equatorial Guinea or Cameroon or Eritrea springs to mind, right? Uganda, whose leader's been there since 1986. And in addition to those sort of singular individuals, there are an awful lot of African countries, particularly in the southern part of the continent, where the same party has been in charge since independence. Or you have dynastic succession in some places. Uh, Togo springs to mind. So you have this sense of kind of political continuity, that for a region we often associate with some degree of churn or conflict, and there's a remarkable amount of what looks like political stability, right? And it's all has roots in developments decades and decades ago. But African societies are, as has been pointed out, incredibly young. And I just want to hit you with some comparisons to help us shift our mindset on what it means to have a particularly youthful demographic. So, most Americans, when you talk about youth demographics having kind of political significance, their minds go to 1968 in this country, where uh, sort of a political awakening among young people was part of a countercultural movement, part of a debate in this country about the Vietnam War. And there was a real sense that young Americans were influencing the direction of the country politically and culturally. And at that time, indeed, we did have a bulge of young Americans. The portion of American society in 1968 that was 15 to 24, so of the age of political awareness, if not necessarily the age of enfranchisement, was about 23% of all adults. So we're lopping off the kids here. That's really big, and it made a difference. In the Arab Spring, Egypt, Tahrir Square, 2011, that same portion of young people, 15 to 24, was more like 32% of the whole adult population. And they made a massive um, uh, impact on the nature of Egyptian politics. In over a dozen African countries, that portion is more than two-thirds of the total adult population. In several countries, it's more than 70% of the total adult population. So we're not talking about something that we have a lot of familiarity with, a lot of quick comparisons that actually make sense. We're talking about a tremendously young set of societies. Now, of course, incredibly diverse, different histories, different cultures, different political economies. But when I think about the through line of what I'm seeing across the continent, I really do think that these demographics are the place to start. Now, the northern tier of countries across the top of the African continent, and then the very south, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, they have different demographics. They're further along in a demographic transition. But pretty much the rest of the continent is in this tremendously youthful phase that is going to be growing for some time. So this is not a youth bulge like you saw in East Asia, where the group of people engaged in the labor force in their most productive years was significantly larger than the dependents, the very aged or the children, and therefore, created this big economic engine. That's not what we're talking about. The demographic pyramids are still quite wide, so the dependents, the children, right? It's a huge group of dependents below this ever increasing group of young adults joining the labor force, and this is tremendously challenging. So we've got these interesting demographics and these sort of very rigid, old school political systems. And what's happening right now, I think, is a real sort of moment of mismatch between the politics and the demands of a society. And I do think urbanization is a big part of it. As noted, we're just a few years out from more Africans living in urban centers than not. So I think this is an important thing to point out for Americans who often kind of tend to conjure up rural images when they think about African societies. But it's also tremendously important to think about where politics might be going on the continent. So you have these big growing labor forces, increasingly urban labor forces. And this means a need in cities for affordable housing, for transportation infrastructure, water infrastructure, access to power. These are goods that one expects a state to provide. Um, and that is a set of demands that a lot of these governments are not terribly well positioned to respond to. Then you add in the digital technology piece. So there's also just a lot of, as Africa becomes more integrated into the global economy and global culture, right? We're all listening to Afro beats more than we used to. We're exposed to more African creative content. They're exposed to our content as well. There is a Pan-African and global conversation going on around governance, around how uh, young people's quest for a dignified life, for a job that makes sense, can and is or is not being met by the state. So I think that there are, these really important demographic trends. There's this increasing access to information, to communication that changes the nature of political organizing. And then the other factor, excuse me, I want to point you to is really about political narratives. So, as mentioned, right, there's been a lot of continuity at the top in African political systems, while underneath that top layer, societies have changed so dramatically, growing in numbers, urbanizing, becoming more exposed to each other, to the world. And this means that some of the big political narratives that have been driving um, politics are, as many Africans would say, past their sell-by date. So the most obvious example of this actually does come from South Africa with its more advanced demographic transition. But as we all know, in the last general election, the ANC lost its outright majority for the first time, and this happened uh, in an election where ANC figures were campaigning on we've delivered the country from apartheid, which is incredibly powerful, right? This is the Party of Liberation leading this country out of this grotesque historic injustice. But for the number of South Africans increasingly who have no lived experience of the apartheid era, that's sort of beside the point, right? In the minds of the people who devised the ANC's campaign, the narrative was, look how much better the situation is now than during the apartheid era, and we deserve credit for that. For an awful lot of young South Africans, it was uh, my job prospects have not improved. My access to power is unreliable. I'm convinced that my government is um, awash in corruption and that elites are self-dealing when there's so much need in society. And this mismatch led to an electoral result that I think was quite surprising for an awful lot of people. You see mismatches like that all over the continent. In Uganda, President Museveni has been in charge since 1986. He and his national resistance movement, the real kind of underlying political narrative of Ugandan politics has been, hey, the NRM delivered this country from the kind of chaotic years of political violence under Idi Amin and Milton Obote. And that's true. But if most Ugandans, as is the case, weren't alive in the Amin and Obote years, this idea that we need to keep the government we've got because that's what stands between us and the chaos of the past is not tremendously compelling. And the concerns are much more about cost of living and corruption issues. And polling across the continent shows us that jobs, cost of living, and corruption are consistently at the top of the list of what African societies want addressed. And remember, when you're thinking about African demographics, a public opinion poll properly weighted is a youth survey in all of these countries, right? Young people are so much bigger, I'm so sorry, than the rest of that adult demographic. Um, the UNDP did a really interesting set of surveys in African democracies and in some of the African countries that have experienced recent coup d'etat, places like Mali, Burkina, Niger, um, Gabon, Sudan, Guinea. And one of the questions that they ask, again, the public, which means an awful lot of youth, was if you supported the coup, why did you support it? And far and away, the answer wasn't, I love military governance, or I think that having the military in charge will help us with our insecurity problems. It was actually just time for a change. So there's this huge grievance base that society is not set up to provide the access to dignified jobs and dignified urban living that people want. There is a sense that something has to change. And what's driving politics in an awful lot of these places is young people looking for ways to express that demand for change. So I want to take you now to Kenya, where the last general election that brought President Ruto to power actually had terrible, terrible turnout. And I don't think this is surprising because that was an election between President Ruto, who was at that point a deputy president. He ran as an outsider, but he was part of the previous administration and a longtime senior political figure. And Raila Odinga, longtime opposition leader, revered in many quarters, two members of the same political class that has been in charge in Kenyan political circles for decades. And young people simply didn't turn out to vote. And a lot of people said, oh, look, this youthful generation of Kenyans is so politically apathetic. Well, give it a little time because President Ruto then comes into office and finds that there is very little fiscal space in which he can operate. There's tremendous debt burden. And in trying to avoid default, he's working with international financial institutions, trying to tighten things up, get more revenue coming into the state with a lot of new taxes. The population already squeezed, the vast majority already working in the informal sector, better educated than their parents, with worse job prospects, are now dealing with all these new taxes, and they've had enough. And what we saw were 2 summers worth of massive political protests, not just in Nairobi, in cities all across the country that actually forced the president to back down on his finance bill, reshuffle his cabinet, and the tensions that exist between the state and society persist. In Kenya, we saw them just over this last week as young people tried to uh, commemorate those protests and the people who lost their lives in them. So all of this matters, I think. I'm bringing it home here. All of this matters for the US because as we think about the changing nature of global order, as we uh, look for ways to extend a peaceful and prosperous period in American history, there's no way we can ignore what will soon be a quarter of the world's population. But that also then means we cannot continue to imagine that the Africa of the future will resemble politically the Africa we're used to. There is a massive desire for political change on the continent. It will be expressed in very different ways depending on this different societies with their different histories. But the one kind of certainty that I see is that expecting the Africa of the future to look like what we've come to expect in the past is a huge mistake. And as China, as Gulf states like the UAE build out a grand strategy that features Africa quite prominently in their quest to be more influential, um, ensure their supply chains, and protect their own security. I think a lot of those uh, states are farther ahead than the US in thinking strategically about Africa, but I'm not sure that they are as prepared for the amount of grievance, desire for change, and political experimentation that we're likely to be seeing. So, on a final note, I want to be clear that it's not that I think political change is likely to mean violence or chaos. This is not what I'm saying. I think, we've seen in some places with strong democratic norms, we've seen some very surprising election results trying to push for change. The Zambia in 2021, the most recent Senegalese election. In other places, we've seen support for military governance. In still others, what we're seeing is this kind of a la carte issue related mobilization, like we've seen in Kenya. So I think there'll be some really interesting lessons for other countries, including our own, as we worry about democratic decline, um, and how to strengthen the connective tissue between government and population. I think we're going to be seeing so many different attempts to do that um, in Africa, and we're likely to get some really positive and exciting innovations in addition to some things that simply will not work. And so that's a good reason for us to be paying close attention.
Well, you do have a smile on your face, so it sounds like you have hope, which is fantastic. Thank you for that opening. And I should have said at the beginning, Africa is a massive continent, right? And there's no way to discuss this topic without it feeling as though you or I are generalizing, which of course is not what we're trying to do here. But we do have some questions in the queue, so I'll just ask a few before we do get to the audience questions. As a reminder, if you're listening, you'd like to ask Michelle Gavin a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and please be concise, keep it brief so we can get through as many questions as possible. Let's just start with the theme of democracy.
Mm.
Um, just if you had to assess the current outlook for democracy in Africa, what is your assessment?
So I think democracy is in big trouble on the continent, and I think there are a couple reasons for that. So the first one is democracy has a huge brand problem.
Mm,
And that is because there have, since the end of the Cold War and the advent of multi-party democracy throughout the continent, there has developed a system of electoral authoritarianism in an awful lot of places,
okay.
where you have the sort of trappings of democracy in the sense that there are regular elections, um, but you don't actually have democratic governance. So the judiciary is not independent, the press is not free. Um, the elections may occur, but they also may be a foregone conclusion. uh, Elites can manipulate the Constitution to stay past term limits. There's very little confidence in the integrity of these systems. And so you'll see a lot of social media discourse, for example, after, say, Paul Biya was just reelected recently. He is, for I believe his eighth term. He's rarely seen in public. He spends much of his time in Switzerland at the Intercontinental. He's not a dynamic leader for a very, very young Cameroonian population, but he was quote unquote reelected. And when that happens, what you see is a huge outcry on social media saying, this is the democracy they tell us we should be protecting. This is what very nice. This is so we've sort of allowed the term to be degraded to where it's kind of slapped on any political system that goes through an election-like event. So this is very helpful for, folks in Moscow who are quite busy pushing kind of anti-Western, anti-democracy narratives throughout the continent. And that really resonates when that's what your understanding of democracy is. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is this fundamental mismatch between the demands at the population level. Once again, they're about jobs, cost of living, corruption, and the capacities of African governments. So you could have the best intentioned, um, most ethical government on earth, but they come into office, there's a massive debt burden.
Mhm.
The vast majority of African countries are spending more time servicing or more money servicing debt than they are on health and education. And this is, it's not possible for such a well-intentioned government to extract itself from that kind of structural set of constraints. So the kinds of investments that you would make to try to spur job creation, they aren't on the table because there's no fiscal space. And that is a democracy challenge because what you're in a situation where the demand signal from constituents is clear, and there's not really a way for those votes and that political expression to lead to the action that they wish to see. This is something's broken. And as difficult as it is to imagine right now, we're going to have to get our minds around debt relief um, because it's very hard to imagine overcoming that current mismatch without it.
So, two follow-up questions on that. What is the awareness of the average African voter of that scenario? And two, what are the proposed solutions?
Um, so depending on where one is, you can find some very, very savvy uh, average man on the street type situations. Certainly in Kenya, some of these political movements, they're very aware that the reason for all these extra taxes is because of this fiscal squeeze. Um, Simultaneously, they see evidence of tremendous self-enrichment in the ruling political elite. And so their view is first, don't lend us any more money. First, we have to tackle corruption. Because if you do, it simply will go into their pockets and it'll be in somebody's, lovely yacht in the Mediterranean. Um, that's an incredibly, I think, kind of sophisticated and savvy understanding. But we have to take the next step with it, which is that means that the frustration and sense of grievance lies not just with their government. They are frustrated with the corruption there, but their awareness of this structural tension then kind of lands squarely at Washington's door. Because for most African societies, there is no real distinction between the US government and the policies of the Bretton Woods institutions. There is You can quibble about this, but the perception is absolutely that it is structured this way because Washington, the most powerful country in the world, wishes for it to be structured this way. And that is a problem for us.
If you had to pick a handful of countries that you're watching most closely right now, particularly in terms of the big issues between protest movements and job creation, anti-corruption, what countries come rise to the surface that we would could also be watching to look for these themes?
Sure, definitely Kenya. Um, the Gen Z mobilization that we have seen there in the past couple of years is unlike anything Kenyan politics has seen before. And can that be sustained? Can it find expression at the ballot box, right? Because at the end of the day, Kenya is a democracy, flawed like every other democracy, certainly like our own. But can all of that momentum coalesce around some kind of governing alternative? Um, doesn't look great right now. We'll see. But that degree of discipline and message savvy, and in some ways, grassroots democratic activism that we saw. I mean, you should have seen these TikToks that people made around the finance bill, describing it and its implications in a range of local languages. It was, if you were describing what democracy means to a sort of beginning political science class, you would use these to help people understand. So there's a lot to like um, about this activism. And I think there's going to be really interesting years ahead as it butts up against this kind of old way of doing business in politics in Kenya, and the old ethnic math. I think Senegal is a really interesting place to watch as well. Here's a country um, that would seem to have more in common um, with Sahelian states, and when there was a lot of uh, tension and frustration around the efforts of the previous president, Macky Sall, to stay in power or to orchestrate the election to ensure his handpicked successor would win. Senegalese again took to the streets and they resisted a tremendous amount of pressure uh, to embrace a military solution and refused, said their frustration with Macky Sall, with the old ways of the Senegalese government dealing with France. All of that was real, but it didn't mean they wanted to pivot toward this kind of Moscow endorsed military governance model. They wanted Senegalese democracy to work. Some young Senegalese lost their lives in this effort. They end up with a kind of undeniable electoral landslide for PASTEF, the party in power now. But then, as they arrive in office, uh, having promised change to clean up corruption and to create jobs, they look under the rug and what do they find? Oh no, Senegal's debt problem is even worse than they'd realized. There was all this hidden debt that was never
Mm.
disclosed publicly, never disclosed to lawmakers. This is um, such an interesting example to me of tremendous social cohesion around democratic values, very, very clear and cohesive demand signals, a government that I think does want to deliver, um, and fiscal space that is basically non-existent. So you ask yourself if we do care about the future of democracy at all, um, shouldn't someone be trying to help? Shouldn't someone be, shouldn't there be some broader conversation about what happens in places like Senegal where a government arrives and finds there's literally no room for maneuver, no way to respond to the demands of constituents? And I think, in Senegal, that's particularly poignant given that young Senegalese are losing their lives every week on treacherous journeys, trying to get to Europe, not because they don't love their country, but because they are just looking for dignified work. So the stakes are really high. So I think Zambia is another interesting example of that as well. And I would continue to keep an eye on Uganda. I do not think that the increasing authoritarianism there is sustainable in the long term. And we just saw over the weekend President Museveni's son, an heir apparent who is quite an erratic social media presence, announced that he had decided to shut down an independent newspaper and broadcaster. Uh, there's on what constitutional basis, it's very unclear. Um, and I don't think Ugandans will just continue to accept um, this sort of uh, erratic governance, the very thing the NRM supposedly delivered that country from.
We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll ask one final question, which of course is how U.S. policy under the Trump administration has influenced trends in Africa.
Well, um, one of the clear implications to me of this kind of inflection point, this moment of desire for political change on the continent, is that to understand where things are headed, we need a much more nuanced sense of what's happening on the ground because it's the very easy thing is to equate um, volatility with instability. Those are not the same thing, right? A stable country, you know, countries look very, very stable. Candidly, Rwanda looked incredibly stable in the 90s before the RPF launched its offensive. It was the development darling, right? So, but stability can be incredibly misleading. Some places are very stable until they are absolutely not. And so, as we fail to staff up our embassies, and our diplomatic presence in Africa had been understaffed for a long time anyway, because it's not seen as career enhancing to do a lot of tours on the continent, which is appalling. Uh, we have less information about what's happening. As we now have no USAID presence, we have less community level knowledge. So we've undercut our own ability to listen and even just be aware of what's happening in these societies while sending messages that suggest disdain for African uh, populations. And I think the kind of model of transactionalism is a bad fit for a moment in which there's so little trust in political elites. On the bright side, I will say that talking about the importance of commercial diplomacy, of stronger economic ties, I think this is a message that, frankly, US administrations since the Clinton administration have tried to emphasize to less than compelling results. So I think this is quite welcome. The question is sort of the how, um, and uh, if we were pursuing aggressive commercial diplomacy strategy with appropriate staffing, with an emphasis on transparency as part of our comparative advantage to other external partners, I think that'd be great. I don't think that's exactly how this is playing out.
Well, that leads great into a question from one of our members, Carrie Bass, who asks, with the recession of classic Western democracy, can U.S. African American led business position enterprise to be mutual beneficial and how? So this would be a business to business communication.
I think it's incredibly important. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. As as we're likely to see some changes at the in the political sphere, the enduring ties of business to business relationships and also of cultural and civil society connections, I think can be the kind of um, infrastructure, the kind of basic foundation for our bilateral relationships with countries around the continent that will necessarily have to kind of pivot and be in different getting to know you phases as our government changes, as their governments change. So I think it's incredibly important. And, when I look at what's happened, for example, to U.S. South African relations in this second Trump administration, where the Trump administration has seemed very focused on really making an example of South Africa. um, I'm constantly reminded of the earlier era in which, when the US was, for Cold War reasons, still supporting the apartheid government before the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act and the overriding of the presidential veto. When we were doing that, there was at the societal level a lot of Americans who were building ties with South Africans who were trying to change their own society, and they created that strong foundation for a very different official bilateral relationship um, in the future. And so I, I think there's um, there are a few things that are more important right now than sort of doubling down on those business to business, civil society to civil society relationships.
On the theme of what is happening beneath the surface, so to speak, Ben Spears asked, what kinds of governance or political organizing experiments do you see or anticipate taking place in Africa? Are these likely at the national or subnational levels involving youth specifically or marginalized groups generally?
All of the above. So I think we are absolutely seeing some subnational, some municipal experiments. Um, you know, it used to be that very powerful ruling parties maintained their dominance because they could control rural areas
Mm.
so easily. Sometimes that was through kind of indirect means, relationships with local traditional leaders. Um, they could control the information environment as Africa has changed so dramatically, municipal leaders are kind of the first line of having to cope with uh, constituents who have access to a lot of information, who organize together, who might live in an informal settlement in a city and not have access to power, but they can see in that same city how the mayor lives, how political elites live. Um, and so the sense of relative deprivation is quite acute. Um, so yes, I think that there are some really interesting municipal elections to follow on the continent in places like Mozambique, where if if you're an American who pays attention to African politics, you think Mozambique is a story of two sides. There's Frelimo and there's Renamo when they fought each other in the Civil War, and now Frelimo won, and now Frelimo's the governing party and Renamo's the opposition. Young people in Mozambique just call it Frenamo. It's all the same to them. And in that last general election, you saw this very surprising mobilization around a third party candidate kind of coming from the private sector, um, uh, really challenging the grip that Frelimo has on governance. So I think some of the experiments we will see will be these electoral experiments. Um, I think we're also seeing in the nature of protest movements a lot of innovation. Um, if we take Uganda, for example, where it's not as safe. It's not that it's safe to mobilize on Kenyan streets. There are young Kenyans who lost their lives, but it's certainly safer than it would be in Uganda, where the government has no qualms about mobilizing um, the military and threatening and executing on their threats of violence. But um, online, you and in this space, this digital space, Ugandans have been engaging in over the last few years these what they call online exhibitions. It started with the pothole exhibition, where Ugandans would just snap a photo of, um, the poor condition of the road in their neighborhood and put it up as if it were kind of an artistic display. But what it really was, sort of a demand for more accountable governance. And then they moved from potholes to healthcare, snapping photos of overcrowded waiting rooms, of dilapidated equipment. Uh, they did a policing exhibition, getting more and more sensitive, but finding spaces to hold uh, authority to account without necessarily having to risk their lives. And you did see some of these political figures, trying to take pictures themselves, filling potholes, or, handing over the PPE to the clinic workers. Is it fundamentally changing the governance problems that Ugandans want to address? No, but is it finding new ways um, to have some connection between what a constituency is demanding and what someone in a position of authority feels they must respond to? Absolutely.
A question from Salvatore Tremarchi asks, how can young African activists bridge that gap between highly effective digital mobilization, as you were describing, to actually affecting change, creating sustainable institutionalized political power to effectively challenge entrenched parties at the ballot box? I think a lot of American young people, anybody can get online and create a TikTok, but changing a system, you know, having real world implications, that's the question. That's a much higher bar.
It is. And it's not easy, right? You can see where movements have started online and then spilled into kind of physical protest and demonstration have affected legislation, the repeal of that finance bill. Um, in Madagascar, it led to a coup. There was a massive, started online, then a massive outpouring of frustration with their government, and then the military swoops in, uh, pretending, masquerading essentially as an agent of um, this youth movement, and now in a very uneasy relationship with it. Uh, but I think as learning, everything is iterative. And so some of those young Kenyans who were a part of that very flat organizational structure that led to these protest movements are also continuing to organize around voter registration. Um, some of the less visible but critical kind of nuts and bolts of beginning to build the capacity to flex that political muscle in real life at the ballot box. Do I think we're going to see it right away? I don't. Do I think that the seeds are being planted? I absolutely do. And I don't know how much longer this military government in Madagascar can hang on in such a uneasy relationship with supposedly the very people who brought it to power. So you can go, you can see examples of that kind of military usurping popular movement in Sudan that have gone so horrifically wrong, it's hard to describe. Um, but I don't think that that's the only way that story can end.
I'd like to turn to questions from some Georgians in the African diaspora. We have Joseph from Ghana, who says he's an alum of Emory University here in Atlanta
Oh,
and still
great.
lives in Georgia. Joseph asks, with the gradual loss of confidence in democracy in the continent and the desire for youthful revolution to democratic governance, do you see terrorists taking the opportunity to expand and take over some African countries?
I mean, I definitely see, I'm so sorry, radical extremists seizing their opportunities, particularly in the Sahel, right? Um, and do I think I that the um, frustration with democratic governance that helped make it easier for militaries to seize power in the Sahelian states uh, has been a boon to these um, radical extremists? I do, because you know these military governments that control the information environment so tightly, it's very hard to continue to actually be accountable for anything if you can make sure that the story that gets told is always one of your great victory, despite the fact that, the extremists control more territory in, say, a Burkina today than they did before the coup and the counter coup. So, do I think that radical extremists can harness the dissatisfaction of these youthful populations to gain support? Not really. Um, I don't think that there's much on offer there that is commensurate with the demands of young people. I think it's easier in more remote, non-urban settings um, where the kind of livelihood opportunities are very few and far between for that kind of extremist recruiting to really find purchase, I think. Um, and when I think about, Nigerian society and the various, do I think that organized crime can benefit from this? 100%. Um, but not necessarily terrorist movements that have this kind of very specific uh, religious and political agenda. But I do think that, yeah, in the absence of licit pathways to dignified livelihood, illicit pathways, yeah, they tend to gain from there
Mhm.
not being something else on offer.
A question from Kevin Moeba, who says, as a young African in the diaspora, what role do you see us playing, not only in politics, but also in economic development across the continent? And part two of his question is, if you were in the position of a young person of African descent today, where would you start building stronger bridges between Africa and the diaspora?
Okay. Um, I'm not sure I have amazing advice. It's been so long since I was a young person. Um, so the first thing I would say is that the diaspora has been incredibly important in a number of these kind of nascent change movements, um, going all the way back to the change in Gambia's governance. Um, that was a really interesting, compelling case of uh, local grievance making common cause with diaspora sort of resources and social capital to help get kind of change over the high hurdle. Um, Kenyans have helped to, in the diaspora, have helped to amplify key messages and to contest some of the official messaging around protests and state violence. Similarly, in Nigeria, you did have a tremendous mobilization in the diaspora around the last general election. Now, it came in the flavor of enthusiasm for a candidate that was associated with some very specific Nigerian identities. Um, but I think that the reveal of how potent that political muscle is when you get the diaspora involved was a lesson that political strategists will take forward in Nigerian politics. So I think there's a lot there. Uh, again, I come back to my belief that uh, as we're all kind of searching for governance models that work, there's a lot to like about uh, non-governmental ties, business ties, and cultural ties. And what I think young people in the diaspora have this huge advantage of not having to get over their anachronistic, undifferentiated ideas, which is where an awful lot of Americans find themselves. Um, and then, then there's the frustrating, I'm sure, work of having to explain to fellow Americans, potential investors, that an investment in Ghana does not carry the same risk that an investment in Congo does. Obviously, wildly different, right? But I think we're really bad at assessing risk in this country, and we really struggle with market differentiation. So I think, the more the diaspora can be an amplifier for helping people to just have a more accurate, um, more differentiated, more modern idea about what the continent looks like. This is all to the good. It can only improve the situation, the ability to assess risk, the business opportunities, the chances for um, content creators and creative communities to collaborate together. Uh, we're all wondering where jobs are going to come from in our society as we move into this AI dominated world. But if you want to see a job creation challenge, consider any African state. Uh, there's there are really good reasons to find ways to collaborate.
We will wrap up today's program. Please join me in thanking our expert speaker, Michelle Gavin, for her time today. You're also invited to register for our next virtual program, which is this coming Wednesday, July 1st. Join us for NATO in a Changing World, a conversation with Kay Bailey Hutchison featuring the former U.S. ambassador to NATO and senator from Texas. That's free and open to the public with registration at our website, wacatlanta.org. You can also sign up to receive our weekly newsletter there. You're going to receive a 3-question email survey about this program. Please take just a minute to fill it out. Your feedback really does help us improve our programming. And finally, the video of today's conversation with Michelle Gavin will be posted on YouTube on the World Affairs Council of Atlanta's channel. Go ahead and take a look again and share it with your friends or interested people in your network. And while you're there, feel free to go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks again, Michelle. Thanks to our audience for joining us today, and have a wonderful Monday.